It's a very great privilege to be here today and to share what I hope to share with you. Let me say at the very beginning that what I really want to do is to make available resources and then to share what I think is our very exciting opportunity at this point in time to help people become more aware of the effectiveness, the value, and the significance of natural family planning, not only because of all the wonderful things that Archbishop Cordileone has said in his excellent opening talk, but also because there is an increasing interest in the secular world, especially among women, to find natural methods of understanding fertility. And I'll document this, I'll give you the references to it shortly. You will find in your parishes an increasing number of women who are looking for natural methods of understanding their fertility, who are becoming increasingly aware of all the problems associated with the various modalities of contraception. And so we are in a very privileged and unique position of being able to be what I've described here as stewards of the tradition. That is, people who are able to communicate a heritage of having concerned ourselves with this important question of finding natural means of understanding fertility, its relationship to childbearing, addressing the problem of infertility, which is becoming an increasing reason why women are looking towards natural family planning as a solution not to the problem of becoming pregnant, but to the desire to become pregnant in an age, tragically, where having sown the wind, we're reaping the whirlwind of all the consequences of sexually transmitted diseases, which people imagine are so easily treatable, and which is often true for men who are aware that they have an STD much more quickly, but for women can result in indolent infections that certainly increase infertility. And that is a significant problem which is causing women to turn more and more towards whatever can be provided, but hopefully natural responses as well. We are the stewards of a heritage and a tradition that has been looking at these questions for centuries and looking at the science involved for decades. So the more aware we can be of the resources we can share, the more able we will be to be good stewards of our tradition. As far as what you'll be seeing projected, it's all available on the internet. You don't have to worry about taking notes. If you add an L to my last name, Dysinger, and then .com, that's the website. And if you go there at the bottom of that page, which has all the courses that I teach at St. John's and some I don't teach anymore, at the bottom of the page there will be a link to HV50, and if you click on that, this is what will come up. So everything you're going to see today is available to you to download, to have available at your leisure, and I'll make sure that the links work for quite some time in the future. So we can be stewards of a tradition and we can be heralds of a kingdom. That is to say, we can help people to understand the gospel as a way of life that makes us more truly human. The notion of naturalness is becoming increasingly popular, and in fact, we can understand that and apply that, especially in light of Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, and the basis which it has in the writings of his predecessors. Naturalness, to live in accordance with nature, is something that makes us more truly human, that enables us to interact with the world we've been given, and opens up possibilities that have only just begun. Part of what I'd like to do, in addition to letting you know about various resources that exist and about this fantastic opportunity we have to seize the moment of people interested in natural methods, part of what I'd also like to do is to try to help us understand why so many clergy are resistant to talking about natural family planning, and why there is such a terrible misunderstanding. You still meet clergy today, and it's not just those of us with gray hair. You still meet clergy and you encounter people who write about natural family planning who wrongly equate NFP with the rhythm method, which was an early method, not ineffective, but certainly nowhere near as effective as current methods are. There's a lot of disinformation. And it doesn't primarily have to do with pig-headedness or stubbornness. It can be understood if we look a little bit at the history of how natural family planning came into existence and what it is that one is grappling with when you try to explain to people that we really are looking at a new era. The original work that created the so-called rhythm method, which is a calendar-based calculation based on and presuming a regularity in the woman's cycle, which one has to say today, with women being employed, with all these stresses to which they're subject in the modern world, has the effect of meaning that women's cycles are probably less regular than they were in the past. The rhythm method does depend on a certain regularity, and it was originally devised based on much more observations that had been made longer ago, but it really began in the 1930s with a Japanese gynecologist and a German gynecologist, Ogino and Knaus, who at the same time published observations. And this is going to be important. The scientific community will only be aware of something and begin to take it seriously if a method is published in a respected journal, if it's peer-reviewed and something that people are aware actually exists. So it is important to note when this became available to the wider medical community and therefore to the wider patient community as a result of having become known nationally or internationally. And that really began in the 1930s. The calendar rhythm method then resulted or created a model by which one would effectively try to anticipate the days of fertility based on the earlier cycle, the previous cycle. Now, this is not just some terrible relic of the past that needs to be abandoned. In fact, there's been a recent development at Georgetown University, which they call the standard days beads, which is a kind of a rather more graphic depiction of the nature of the woman's cycle, intended, I believe, for people in the developing world where charting is going to be more difficult to explain, to accomplish. And it's not that it doesn't work, it does, but it depends on the regularity of the cycle and an anticipation of the cycle that's coming to be like the one that was just passed. This was basically the form of natural family planning that was principally, chiefly available at the time Humanae Vitae was published. So this is what priests and lay people thought natural family planning was when Humanae Vitae first appeared. And that explains a significant amount of the reluctance and the concern. This method is, if you're using it to avoid pregnancy, more effective than some barrier methods, but it is not overwhelmingly effective. And that's what the public came to know. That's what her priests heard as a complaint. And unfortunately, this was locked into the minds of many in the late 60s that this was what the church was requiring, dependence on a method that was not particularly effective. We'll look at the actual times of the development of other forms of natural family planning in just a moment. Having said that, contraceptive technology became widely available beginning in 1958. So remember, Humanae Vitae published in 68, 10 years before. Contraceptive technology became more and more widely available. First was a form of the intrauterine device, the Margulies coil, and later the so-called Lippes loop. You will still see documentation today that says the method by which the intrauterine device works is mysterious or unknown. Well, that's silly. It's obvious. It is a method that introduces a state of near perpetual inflammation in the woman's uterus. It is a foreign object placed in a context where you have a very, very delicate tissue that is in a constant process of change, preparing to receive new life, and this foreign object makes it difficult or impossible for new life to implant. In other words, it is not contraceptive, It is abortifacient. It is after the embryo has been not only fertilized, but has begun to develop into a multicellular stage, the intrauterine device prevents that new life from implanting within the woman's uterus. And you see two examples here of what are basically plastic technology, but science has been trying to make this even more certain by coating certain intrauterine devices either with progestogens, with hormones, or with poisons, copper, which creates a very thin film of a toxic substance. So effectively, the intrauterine device is introducing something foreign, creating a hostile environment to prevent new life from developing, and it was the first widely available, effective form of birth control. Various forms of it were developed and changed. The infamous Dalkon shield, which looks like an instrument of torture rather than actually a device to aid in the prevention of pregnancy, was actually responsible for death. This is a device which introduced not only inflammation, but serious infection. There were at least 17 recorded deaths attributable to the use of this device, and the settlement with the company that manufactured it resulted in over $3 billion being paid out to the survivors. So this is a technology with a somewhat dark history. And it was in the 1960s, and in fact in 1960, that the first hormonally based contraceptive became widely available. The mechanisms by which these hormones work varies depending upon how much estrogen or how much progesterone they contain. One can say, in general, this is a generalization, that the more progesterone, the more likely it is to not be primarily contraceptive, that is, preventing conception, but possibly also being abortifacient, again, preventing new life from implanting. And many of the devices and pills that are available to now contain increasingly large amounts of progesterone. I should add that in the last 7 or 8 years, there has been a concerted effort on the part of the medical community to try to deny this, to deny the basic science that demonstrated it long ago, and to try to say, oh no, it's not abortifacient, it's probably acting by preventing conception. Well, the science is pretty clear. So it was really in the 50s and the early 60s that contraception became widely available, and Humanae Vitae was promulgated, let me just reload the frame, in 1968, and it was actually in July that that happened. Right, we're working from the website, fine. The other method which, or the really beginnings of a natural family planning technology beyond the rhythm method, is a result of temperature observations, which in theory began in the 1800s, but it really was in the 1940s up to the 60s that a method was developed in which a woman could take her temperature using a very sensitive thermometer, not the thermometer you normally use for measuring fever, but one that has much more careful graduations, and notice changes in temperature that reflected fertility. The initial efforts were rather complex. The initial forms of what becomes the basal body temperature method required a fair amount of mathematics, experience, and teaching in order to be able to interpret. But beginning in the 1950s and 60s, John Marshall, working together with the World Health Organization, Marshall was a neurologist in Great Britain. He developed a simplified form of the interpretation of this temperature data, which was known as the cover line or 3/6 methods. You don't have to worry about or remember any of this, but just to know that it became more widely usable. Required less sophistication, less mathematics, and an adaptation of it is pretty much what is practiced today as the symptothermal method, although it includes both temperature observations and observations of the woman's mucus symptom as well. Here again, be aware of the timing. His article that was published in The Lancet which is a very prestigious British journal, did not appear until 1968. So people did not know about this method and did not know that it was tested and reliable until after the promulgation of Humanae Vitae, which again means that priests were not aware of this. This was not something that was in popular consciousness. The other principal method of natural family planning, the ovulation method, here again, based on observations that existed long before, was made into something usable principally by the Billings in the 1950s. It was in 1964 that Lynn Billings, Dr. Billings' wife, began first to teach what was called and still is called the ovulation method. And there was a publication in 1964, but it was in an Australian newspaper. There was no national publication in a medical journal until, guess when, 1968. It was only then that in the Lancet, an article appeared that began describing the findings that Dr. Billings had noted and began to describe a test or an attempt to look at people who had been using the Billings method over time. So here again, it's understandable why you have a whole generation of priests, and maybe more than one generation, who imagine that natural family planning is primarily the older rhythm method and who are less familiar with these much more effective natural methods. Beginning in the 1970s, Dr. Tom Hilgers, who is here, please take the opportunity to meet him if you possibly can. He's a wonderful person and a fantastically important person from the perspective of natural family planning, because he, in the Pope Paul VI Institute in Omaha, which I had the privilege of attending and participating in 1979, he has taken the Billings method and refined it. And he's done more than refine the method. He has published numerous articles in respected medical journals that demonstrate the efficacy of this method. So when you encounter in your parish people who wonder whether or not this really is scientifically valid, thanks to Dr. Hilgers, there's a very broad amount of documentation that is pretty much indisputable. The question is taking that knowledge and applying it, making it something that people can profit from and effectively implement in their lives. So we now have two very effective methods of natural family planning: the Creighton or Billings method, which looks exclusively at the woman's mucus symptom, and this often embarrasses priests. They don't want to talk about mucus. Don't want to talk about something that they imagine that this involves some sort of strange manipulation or something. In fact, just to very plainly state it for those who might not be familiar with it, it's a simple observation the woman makes every time she goes to the bathroom. Very simple observation on white toilet tissue, and on the basis of that she can chart, and the Creighton method is as effective when used properly in preventing pregnancy as any other method, including oral contraceptives. So this is a very, very well-documented, effective method. The symptothermal method uses temperature as its primary method. You know, people sometimes ask from the medical perspective, well, which is better? Well, it depends on which you trust the more. Literally, I mean, it depends on which the couple is actually going to feel more comfortable with. You will encounter medically trained people, maybe physicians or nurses or some sort of healthcare practitioners, who imagine that the more information you have, the better the method is likely to be effective. Well, that turns out not to be true. The Creighton method doesn't even look at temperature and has a fantastically great success rate. But sometimes scientific people imagine that the more you look at, the better it's likely to be. So if that's what they're into, God bless them. You know, encourage them to make use of that method. But there is absolutely no reason for internecine strife. There is no reason for wars between competing methods of natural family planning. They both work. The real question is, what is the couple you're working with likely to use? What is most likely to be effective for them? And this raises the very important question, and it's foundational to everything. Who are they going to talk to who introduces them to natural family planning? If they're not privileged, as Archbishop Cordileone said, to have heard about it in high school or elsewhere. You need to know the people who teach NFP in your area. And I don't just mean you need to know their names. You need to know whether they talk like Earth people. Whether they are able to communicate effectively that this is a wholesome, life-giving thing. This is not something that belongs to Catholic cultists. That really is a powerful opportunity to make use of very wonderful resources, which more than, as we'll see, more than Catholics are looking for. So do take the trouble to at least call them on the telephone and talk to them, or invite them to lunch, or find out from the Office of Family Life in your diocese who the recommended teachers are. You need to refer couples to people you trust, whom you know are likely to be effective means of communicating this kind of information, and hopefully who are free of this kind of internecine strife of, oh, well, there's another method, but oh, you shouldn't trust it. Hopefully we can get past that. Hopefully we are getting past that. The other great resource we have, of course, and something in which we ought to constantly be deepening ourselves, is the theology of the body. The tremendous gift of Pope St. John Paul II, who from 1979 to 1984 offered a series of catecheses in the Wednesday audiences, which are now available in multiple forms. In the original translations that were made available from the Vatican. And then there was the discovery of the book that he was using to give these catecheses, written originally in Polish, which has now been translated into English and can be available to people who are seriously interested in the theology of the body and who want a very consistent translation of all the terms, which was unfortunately not always the case in the Wednesday audiences, because you had a pope who was translating his book originally written in Polish, now into Italian, which would then be translated by different translators into English and then published as the official translations. So they're good translations, but they're not always identical in terms of how words are translated. You can get the original now if you would like to. It is readily available. The theology of the body makes available to us an awareness that when people are interested in naturalness, in natural methods of family planning, they are also open to our ability to speak about our role as life-giving participants in creation. We can acknowledge and affirm that sexuality is a great good from God. There was a marvelous rediscovery of the ancient Augustinian insight that the love between a man and a woman is itself an icon, an image of the perichoresis love, the intercommunion between the persons of the Blessed Trinity. That it really is in the context of marriage that one has a kind of an iconic vision of the glory of who God is, life-giving, self-giving love to, well, literally the gift of a person to another. One sees that in marriages, experiences it in marriage, causing Pope John Paul II to say, and I expect this probably curled the hair of some of his listeners, ask yourself the question, what is the only sacrament that comes to us from before the fall? It's not baptism, and it's not the Eucharist, it's marriage. The icon of our unfallen state is the relationship between Adam and Eve in paradise. And that was the basis for a great deal of Pope John Paul II's catecheses, as well as, and this is not always known, he regarded the theology of the body as an extended commentary on Humanae Vitae. And the catecheses conclude with an overt, specific commentary on that document. So Humanae Vitae is itself the birthplace. It is the wellspring of Pope St. John Paul II's theology of the body. Well, I want to make you aware of the fact that you will increasingly encounter people who are interested in natural methods of family planning. There are a variety of approaches, and I just came across an article on July 24th, 2018, that's just a couple of days ago, entitled, "Women Are Turning to Birth Control Smartphone Apps for a Reason." These apps are linked to a thermometer. They are basically a method of attempting to take the basal body temperature, symptothermal approach, and computerize it. Make it something you don't have to think about, talk about. You can take your temperature and your phone will tell you whether you're fertile each day. Well, there are problems with that. Not just whether you can rely on your phone, but we'll look at some of the problems as we go along. The specific app to which people are referring is something called the natural cycles approach. I do not recommend this. There are problems with it, but what is important for us is to be aware of the fact that it is acquiring an unprecedented popularity in Europe, especially in Britain. This is an article from the morning edition of NPR. Probably not many of us listen to NPR on a regular basis, although some may. It's rather biased news. But on this widely heard, very, very popular radio program, there was last year a full discussion of this mobile app designed to prevent pregnancy and the fact that it had received formal European Union approval to be marketed in Europe, and it has been marketed in Europe. It was launched in 2014. This is a screenshot from the site that they maintain. The woman has a thermometer that she uses to check her temperature every morning, and it is linked to an app on her smartphone, and that phone then links to the couple who created it, Elna Berglund and her husband Raoul Schwitzerl. It links to their computer, and they store your data. So gradually over time, theoretically, it develops an understanding of a particular woman's cycles and tells her each morning whether or not she's fertile. The creators of this are not gynecologists. They are not physicians. They are nuclear physicists. They were working on the Higgs boson project, and as a result of their fascination with the mathematical models that were being used to describe subatomic particles, they began to use some of the same models on his wife's temperature and fertility. And I think they believe they've discovered the symptothermal method. I honestly think they believe that they have discovered what has been known and developed and purified and documented for the longest time. Well, they've certainly popularized it. So this is all taken from the description in the NPR article with a whole variety of links. The various lists of effectiveness. Natural Cycles last year had 300,000 users. I think it costs something like, is it £60 a year to subscribe to the service? And then, again, they store your data and they check every morning. Well, as of this month, it has 800,000 users, most of them in Britain. This is becoming very, very popular, very widespread. You can imagine it has made this couple quite wealthy. And they are using a significant part of their wealth to begin to develop a US market. So you will hear more and more about this as time goes by. Now, articles have been raised in concern. Women have said, my phone said I was infertile and I got pregnant. So there are various issues being raised, but there are more concerns than just that. By the way, it isn't just NPR. This is an article from June of 2017 in the British edition of Vogue magazine. This is a fashion magazine read by women. So we're talking about an approach which is basically symptothermal, although not measuring other symptoms other than temperature, which is becoming fantastically widespread in the secular world. Nothing to do with the Catholic Church, nothing to do with an inner spiritual motivation. These are women who do not want to take hormones and do not want to put things in their bodies that are going to set up chronic inflammation. Very understandable. But we have things that are even better than that. And I would point out that one of the difficulties, there are a number of concerns, and I've added these myself. Number one is the very problematic recommendation that on days when a person is fertile, according to this technique, their recommendation is use protection. That is to say, use a barrier device. The man should wear a condom. The woman should use a diaphragm. Well, the barrier methods are notoriously ineffective precisely because they don't do well during the fertile period. So the dangerous aspect of this recommendation is that it is asking the couple or encouraging the couple to use barrier methods at the very time when barrier methods are least likely to be effective. So that's probably one of the reasons for the complaints that this couple is beginning to receive at present. I mentioned the complaints. There's an article that appeared in The Guardian just this month. A woman describes her colossally naive approach to using this, but isn't stopping its widespread use. And my point again is that the founders are not medical professionals. They, as far as I know, are really not profiting from all the research that's been done in the past, nor are they looking at anything other than what they chose to look at. And here's a quote: "We were working at CERN looking for the Higgs boson. We applied the same statistical methods to my wife's ovulation." That's how it was created. You probably can't expect a fully effective method to come out of that. But this is what the women of your parish are more than likely to become aware of and to become attracted to. So to let them know, actually, we have a method, we have a whole series of methods that are actually not only more effective, but completely compatible with, integrated into the Church's teaching, and which have a lot longer history of effectiveness than the method that they're currently aware of. By the way, something particularly useful, and I think I have this, let's just see. A site that uses a similar methodology but is much more Catholic friendly, that is much more seriously based in science and compatible with what we know as natural family planning. If you're working with a couple where what they want is an app and a thermometer, is the Fertility Friend site. This site will also seek to encourage them to do the thing they need to do, which is to say, to find a living, breathing teacher with whom they can speak and who will guide them on days when they have questions, or help the woman if she has physiological problems of one sort or another. The importance of a teacher, the importance of someone to whom you can turn when things seem a little off, or when you have to raise the question, well, what if I've got a fever? Or what if I got up and walked around a little bit before taking my temperature? How do I deal with that? What does that mean in terms of my charting? You're not going to find that on your phone app, but you can find it if you have someone to whom you can speak. So your knowing the teachers is vitally important, and it provides them with yet another level of assurance, to say nothing of connection with a community that will encourage them in using this method in a way that's compatible with church teaching. That's, again, something worth recommending and being aware of. Now, let me check one other little thing before we move along. That is, I just want to see. We're fast approaching the end of our time. I'm supposed to finish at 11, is that right? $11:10. Okay, well, let's Let's just move through a couple of points. These are the principal things I wanted to make you aware of, and also the resources. We'll see a list of resources at the end of this. I think, having talked about what you might call pastoral reservations or concerns on the part of the clergy, please understand that we live in a culture where there has been a powerful promotion of contraception. Governmental, social, political, there's been a pushing of the hormonal and the physical forms of contraception for a long time, and a lot of misinformation. Articles that appeared in 2004 that tried to maintain that actually if you're using hormonal methods of contraception, this is good for your health. Well, this turned out to be completely false. In November 17th, some very fine studies indicated that there is a significant association of hormonal contraception and suicide attempts, depression, and its concomitant after effects, to say nothing of the well-documented physiological problems associated with it. The other problem you face in the parish is the widespread practice of contraception. A very large number, if not the majority, of your people are probably using contraception. How do you speak to that in a way that they can hear? Probably not by telling them they're going to hell. Because they're not going to believe you. We live in an age where that kind of language will probably not go very far. But to use the language of naturalness, to let them know, to invite them to look around and become aware of what the culture on which they're so strongly depending is already encouraging to want, and then to let them know, yes, we have this as well. We have to avoid the tendency towards the kind of skepticism that has regarded authority as something to be not taken seriously. The fact that we are in position of authority and encouraging it doesn't change the fact that it's a good thing. We have to try to combat the ignorance on the part of our fellow clerics with regard to different forms and effectiveness of NFP. And the other factor we live in our culture is periodic abstinence is condemned as wrong, as dangerous, as bad for your health. Well, this is very ironic, because I remember as a medical resident back in the 70s, when we did our segment on sexual counseling and sex therapy, the first bit of advice, not only advice, but requirement for couples who are having troubles with sexuality, with various kinds of sexual issues in their relationship, is to become abstinent for a while. Take a break. The deliberate choice to say we don't always need to be having sex just because I watched a movie and it somehow, made me start thinking sexy thoughts. That there can be a very important quality of abstinence that is actually good for a relationship is something physicians already know, but it is not popular in our culture. It is not popular to talk about or to reflect on. We have to avoid being complicit, as Archbishop Cordileone recommended. We have to be willing to preach. If we never raise the issue, it's never going to be looked at. And the other thing for us to be aware of is that the option of natural family planning as one possible choice among many does not help people, because the choice is often badly informed. Often people are not aware of what they're doing to their bodies. They are not aware of what they're doing to their relationship when they use forms of medically condoned contraception. And finally, we need to be willing to share the benefits of natural family planning. One was mentioned, the low divorce rate. There's no cost once it's learned, no drugs or devices. The couple acquires greater knowledge about their own bodies, and there are profound spiritual and theological considerations. The couple discovers levels of appreciation of one another that will not happen if simply you need to be available for me because I have this desire. Much of this has been documented very well, and I've given references on the website. And finally, we have to be willing to relinquish our embarrassed silence. We're celibates. How can we talk about marriage? How can we talk about the intimacy of a relationship beautiful, transcendent, though it is, but of which we have no firsthand experience. Well, we have to know that and be able to willing to share with people that we are familiar with and have access to methods that are proven and reliable, compatible with Catholic teaching, and as I said, know the people who teach. You don't have to do it alone. You do not have to explain the details of natural family planning, but you need to know whom you can refer the couple to who will do that in a loving and compassionate way. And the point is, as celibates, as spiritual fathers, we in fact do know a lot about loving. We do know a lot about chaste loving, about relationships in which we care for and share in the lives of others, and that we can and should share. Finally, at the very end of this site, if you click onto it, I've listed a number of resources, and many of these are taken from the California NFP site. So that's another wonderful resource to go to. You sign up and then you have access to all of their wonderful resources. But this is a list of the things that you can find there. The Billings Ovulation Method, the Creighton Method, the Couple-to-Couple League, and Northwest Family Services, which teaches symptothermal method, and then a series of sites related to natural family planning. Well, all of that is available to you as you wish. Do we have a minute or two for questions if anybody has anything they want to raise? Well, one question maybe.
Oh, sorry. Father, I know you mentioned the fertility friend about using an app for couples. Now, maybe that's not something that you necessarily recommend a whole lot. I mean, you hear about the sharing between the spouses, and maybe the husband puts the stamps on the the chart and all that. But if they're looking for something that might be helpful from time to time, I mean, to make an analogy, sometimes we pray the breviary using an app on the phone. Probably not ideal. The book is still better. Anyway,
absolutely, and you're right, the question of sharing is important, but even if you're using an app, the husband's going to be asking his wife questions. I remember the natural family planning teacher who comes to us at St. John's every year and gives a presentation to students, and of course she always gets rated much more highly than I do as the instructor for the course. When we do our annual evaluations, everyone loves her presentation. She points out that she does charting. Her husband doesn't do the charting, but he's asking her, what's your temperatures? How are things going? There is a level of communication that takes place and will take place. Apps are going to be unavoidable because people want them. And so knowing that they exist and incorporating them into, there's no reason for not recording on your phone. It's really a question of who has the data, whom do you talk to about the data, can you talk to anybody about the data, and then whom do you share the data with? And I suspect the husband is going to be as interested in the data as his wife. But you're right, it's not quite the same as putting stickers on a chart. Well, just jump up there and ask, yeah.
I can guarantee you my wife and I used Billings in our life, and although she did the charting, I was very attentive to the charting, so it does come into play. So I was just interested in the hesitancy of clergy in the early years looking back at rhythm and untrusting of the newer methods. How is that going in the medical field? Doctors that you work with, when a woman goes to a doctor, are doctors being trained in these methods? Are they understanding in
Thank you for
schools?
asking. I don't know. I can't speak to the question of medical education at present, but my impression is that there is a kind of even if you're aware of the data, even if you know that statistically speaking, Billings, Creighton, and symptothermal, these are extremely effective, and if used properly, are as effective as any of the hormonal methods that people might recommend. Even if you know that, there's one thing that's going to cause physicians to doubt, and that is, forgive me, but physicians can be very condescending towards their patients. They're very much aware that if I tell you to take a pill 3 times a day, you'll be lucky if you take it twice a day. The ability of patients to actually follow instructions is presumed to be at a minimal level on the part of most physicians. So the idea that a couple would actually abstain based on what they found on their app or on their chart or whatever, There's a terrible presumption on the part of medical professionals, and even more so among politicians, that people will breed like rabbits, and the only thing you can do to prevent that is to either sterilize them once and for all, or to do it for a temporary period of time with things like intrauterine devices. I might add on that point, and again, I'd be happy to be corrected on this, I've never met an OBGYN who, if she was a woman who used an intrauterine device, or if he was a man, allowed his wife to use an intrauterine device. But what do you think is the most commonly recommended form of birth control in the third world, in the developing world, by those who are forcing methods on others? The presumption on the part of politicians and physicians is people cannot control themselves, and the best methods are those which don't require any control.
Perhaps a bit of a historical. Oh, sorry, did I cut somebody off again? Go ahead, Father. I thought he was pointing. I'll go next, please.
It's a short thing, you know. I get no respect. Outstanding presentation. Story. I'd been assigned to a parish. First Sunday there was a couple giving a presentation to encourage folks to sign up for their NFP class. And part of that presentation, they said, you know, we've been practicing NFP all our married life, and God has blessed us with 6 children. And I just hear this, whoa, this ain't for me then. Yeah. But anecdotally, my experience with those who do practice NFP often are open to having more children than the general population. I but right. Many Catholics may not want 6 children. So that may be part of the way we present NFP, but it tends to send a sense of, I'm not ready for 6 children, so maybe I don't need to use this. So just some feedback from you.
It certainly is a factor to be aware of, but on the other hand, male infertility is increasingly every year, statistically speaking. The issue of infertility, nobody knows exactly why, all kinds of theories about, pollutants that vaguely resemble female hormones or something, but all sorts of possibilities are raised. With regard to female infertility, part of it is sexually transmitted diseases and consequent scarring of the fallopian tubes. However, there's a medical treatment for that called in vitro fertilization, and it is far more lucrative than teaching natural family planning. So there is, unfortunately, and I'm not saying the medical profession is deliberately trying to push more manipulation and control, but in fact, a lot of OBGYN residents are being trained in vitro fertilization and not trained in the older methods of treating infertility. So more and more the treatment of infertility is in vitro fertilization rather than a whole variety of options that could have existed, had existed in the past. When I was in medical school, there was a book called De Gouwen and De Gouwen, which listed all sorts of fantastic ways of examining a person's body, 5 different ways of percussing a chest, using different parts of the finger. Nobody does that anymore. Send a person for an x-ray. Why bother percussing a chest? So in many ways, very useful skills and things which in medicine have been used in the past are no longer done because it's presumed that this is more effective. And unfortunately, physicians think that you do have a little more control over things if you're doing in vitro. So there are, again, it's not Machiavellian, it's not something people are primarily aware of, but there is a tendency not to regard natural methods as useful because of condescending towards patients who aren't going to be able to abstain and presuming that it's better to do something that really is certain. But unfortunately, the certainty often results in infertility. One more. Again, I don't want to push us past our required times here. Okay.
I listen, and I'm listening, and the natural way is good, and it's the best for sure. And I'm very aware that this is a first world educated method.
Mother Teresa didn't think so.
Well,
and she taught Billings Method very effectively in India.
Yeah. How many people can she teach? See, like in San Bernardino, I don't know how many people are qualified to teach the Billings Method.
You are lucky in San Bernardino.
Yeah.
Because there have been some organizations, I will not mention their names, but those of you who are priests can possibly mention them. There are companies, there are subgroups which have been taking, especially the Billings Method, but symptothermal to some extent, translating it into Spanish and not worrying about copyright. Now, that's not necessarily the best thing to do legally, but it does mean that there are a variety of people, especially in the Hispanic community, that are trying to develop and apply this.
Sure. I mean, I agree. I mean, it's good. I think Pope Francis is also challenging us, saying, look, in some places, there are no teachers. You cannot get people to learn this. And as pastors, when women are learning, they're taking pills, they're using condoms, whatever it is, because they don't control themselves. They don't know how to do it. And the pastor, what do we do? Some people are available. They can do it, and they should do it. And it's great if the teaching is available and they can learn. Those who can't, as pastors, well, there we are. What do we do? That's a big challenge for Pope Francis, which
absolutely.
God bless him.
And Francis in Amoris Laetitia emphasizes the principle of gradualness, which he does not create, which already existed in moral theology, which one finds in Pope Benedict and elsewhere, which is to say, never abandon someone. Never say, well, that's the best you can do, and I'm never going to imagine you could do better. Accept that, okay, well, that's what the person is, but continue to offer the encouragement, continue to be aware of, to encourage them to be aware of alternatives that exist. Because again, a woman who's using hormonal contraceptives is not helping her body. You're watching someone doing something moderately destructive to themselves, and one needs to have the same compassion and desire to assist into a new way of life that you would to, say, an addict or something like that. Well, you know, it's the best you can do using heroin. I guess that's all right. God loves you. Well, okay, you know, God loves you, yes, but I'm not going to abandon you to your addiction. I'm not going to tell you you're going to go to hell because of it, but I'm going to accompany you, another phrase that Pope Francis loves. I'm going to accompany you and try to provide as best I can and encourage you to discover in your life another way of being. The natural family planning teacher who comes and teaches us admits to having contracepted for years and that it took a long time to be able to acknowledge the value and the usefulness of the method that she now teaches evangelically. And thank goodness she had priests like you, willing to accompany, but never to abandon, never to say, you know, okay, well, they're doing the best you can, so, you know, we're not going to even try, but constantly to encourage people to discover something better. Okay, maybe one final thing. Again, I don't want to, if we're moving towards...
I think I was next. Okay, no, I'm just kidding.
If we're moving towards food, I don't want to prevent that. You know,
I have just to kind of change gears a little bit. I have a bit of a historical question. And that is that I know just from reading, you know, ancient documents, church and otherwise, that the idea of avoiding pregnancy has been around for a very long time.
Yes.
And my question is, in the middle of the last century, it seems to have been, by the numbers you showed and the dates that you showed, an explosion in this kind of thinking, 40s, 50s, 60s, all these different methods. Is that just a natural effect of what the sort of evolution of the technology at the time and people were always thinking about this? Or was this some other factor that caused that kind of effect during those years? I'm just curious. It's
really only in the late 1800s that the application of science to disciplines like medicine becomes normal. And that medicine begins to say, well, no, we won't practice medicine that isn't based in what we now would call the natural sciences and the biological sciences. So previously, you know, we had all sorts of disciplines like phrenology. I mean, one of the greatest founders, Benjamin Rush, you know, one of the great medical institutors of this country, really believed that the treatment of virtually every disease was bleeding. I mean, you know, open a vein, the person will get better. And he was not an idiot. It's just that was the prevailing medical tradition up until the mid to late 1800s. So it's only in that period that people begin to ask questions like, in World War I, you know, if a person's lost a lot of blood, maybe we should replenish their body fluids. Oh, what a concept. That didn't exist in World War I. I mean, it was only just beginning to be implemented prior to World War II. So things that we would take for granted that have been proven over time we're in a kind of a very early stage. The technology of things like the barrier methods goes back probably millennia, certainly centuries. But as far as reliable methods, you can find women knowing that what we would today call the mucus symptom was associated with fertility in ancient literature, and occasional references to that. So it's only recently we've thought that we understand it better because we can put numbers next to it. We love numbers.
Just two quick comments. Dr. Hilgers and the Pope Paul Institute are at the closing stages of developing an app to go along with his method, which also includes a practitioner to walk that journey with you, whether it's in the paper charts or in the app that is being developed. Number two, the other side of preventing pregnancy is those women who have an infertility issue. And the Creighton model is an excellent, excellent model in helping those women. In fact, probably most of my wife's clients are infertility clients who come to her from couple to couple league. So
thank you for raising that, because again, the teacher who comes to us, whose primary method is symptothermal, says that that's the case in her practice as well. That a very large number of people who are coming to her now are people who do not want to do in vitro fertilization and do not want to have to go through the hormonal injection cycles, but who simply want to discover, well, can we take advantage of my natural cycles and conceive a child? So I think that's absolutely true, whatever method a person is using. Infertility clients are becoming a bigger and more important issue each year. I should probably stop. Thank you so much.